Good afternoon, bonjour. Je suis Christopher Manfredi, doyen de la Faculté des Arts. Je suis ravi d'être ici aujourd'hui, de vous souhaiter la bienvenue à la 6e conférence du prix Condell. Avant de commencer la conférence, je voudrais partager un peu d'informations sur le prix Condell. The late Peter Condell, who was a commerce graduate from McGill University, but in an apocryphal story failed a history class when he was an undergraduate here, wanted nevertheless to recognize and promote literary and academic achievement in historical writing. For that reason, he established the McGill Condell Prize in Historical Literature, which we call the Condell Prize in short, to be offered each year by McGill University to an individual of any nationality from any country who has published a book determined to have had or likely to have a profound literary, social, and academic impact in the area of history. The university grants a grand prize of $75,000 US and 2 recognition of excellence prizes of $10,000 US. The recipients of the prizes are selected by an independent jury of at least 5 internationally distinguished and qualified individuals selected by the university. And if you're around a week from today, we will be announcing the 3 finalists for the 2014 Condell Prize, which will be awarded on November 20th in Toronto. But as important as the Condell Prize is, certainly to the authors and to the world of historical literature, Mr. Condell realized that he could have an even greater legacy by providing an opportunity to train the next generation of historians. And so in addition to the Condell Prize, he established 2 Condell Fellowships in history for doctoral students at McGill University of $25,000 each. And those are provided every year as well. The prize itself has spotlighted authors from a variety of regions, including the United States, the UK, Italy, and other places in Europe. And of course, we have with us today the 2013 prize winner, Anne Applebaum. Because it says here it has been the tradition, but I actually think it's a condition of winning the prize. You come to Montreal and deliver a public lecture, which brings her here this afternoon. Before I ask the chair of our history department, Elizabeth Elborn, to introduce our speaker this afternoon, 2 little pieces of housekeeping. One is to remind everyone, if they would, to close their mobile phones, turn off their cell phones. And secondly, when we get to the Q&A, you'll notice there are microphones on your desks. When you ask your questions, if you could just push the little button to turn the microphone on, since we're being live streamed and recorded, that will pick up your voice. So I would ask you to do that. And now, without further delay, let me ask Professor Elizabeth Elborn, Chair of the Department of History, to introduce Anne Applebaum.
My warm thanks to Professor Manfredi and to the Condell Foundation for this remarkable occasion. Anne Applebaum has quite an astonishing range. She is a leading public intellectual, a journalist, a policy advisor, as well as being a major historian, something that makes professional historians perhaps somewhat jealous. Anne has a distinguished career. She studied at Yale, at the London School of Economics as a Marshall Scholar, and then at St. Antony's College, Oxford, where I was fortunate enough to meet her, sharing the dubious pleasures of cheap Bulgarian wine at the St. Antony's College cafeteria. In 1988, however, Anne Applebaum moved to Poland to work as a correspondent for The Economist, where she had a front row seat to the tumultuous events that would follow. She worked as the Warsaw correspondent of The Economist from 1988 to 1989. Since then, she has worked extensively as a journalist. The list of newspapers and other periodicals for which she has written is extensive, including The Independent, The Economist, the New York Review of Books, the Wall Street Journal, Prospect, and many others. She is currently a member of the editorial board of the Washington Post, for which she writes a weekly column that is also published in Slate. She directs the Transitions Forum of the Legatum Institute in London. She is also a very serious historian. She unites, I think, the capacity to bring public history to a wide audience with serious scholarship. And that, I think, is something that the Kundal Prize has really sought to recognize. Her 2003 book, Gulag, A History, won the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction in 2004. It describes life in the Gulag, as well as giving a larger history of the Gulag, and has been published in some 24 translations. I would attest to its capacity to speak to ordinary people by the fact that it was prominently on the bookshelf of my father-in-law's family, my father-in-law having been a Gulag survivor himself. She is also the co-author of a cookbook from a Polish country house kitchen. And she has also written a travelogue between East and West across the borderlands of Europe. But today we are celebrating her Kundal Prize for her more recent book, Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe, 1944 to 1956, which explores the ways in which a dozen countries were pushed towards communism in the aftermath of the Second World War. I will not say more about that, however, because Anne will be speaking to some of the themes of that book. I welcome Anne. I want to say how pleased we are that she is here today, and I look forward to her lecture.
Did I press the right button? Can you hear me? Awesome. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you especially to Elizabeth Elbarn, whom I did last see probably 20 years ago in the St. Anthony's College Bar, and did an absolute double take when I met her again this afternoon, having somehow not connected her name with the person that I remember from quite a long time ago. It was an extremely kind introduction. She very sweetly didn't say that I left St. Anthony's having not written a PhD, because I had simply had enough of academic history and wanted to do something else. And she diligently finished her PhD, so she wins the prize of having been better than me. It's really a pleasure to be here. The Kundal Prize made a huge difference to me, and I was very, very grateful to receive it. And I'm thus happy to come back and talk about the book which won the prize. Hoping that somehow I can inspire, since I know there are some students in the room, and I can inspire more people to read history and to write history. I didn't manage to make it my profession because of bad decisions I made when I was 21, but I do envy the people who spend all their time doing it. So I hope, for those of you in the room, thank you very much for coming. Now, as was once traditional at public meetings just like this one, which took place in rooms not unlike this one, some 50 years or so ago, east of the Iron Curtain, east of the Berlin Wall, I'd like to begin with a song. And don't worry, I won't actually sing it because my voice is too bad. But even when I read it aloud, and even when in English, I think the spirit of the song will provide a good introduction to the subject of my talk this evening, which also happens to be one of the central subjects of my book, Iron Curtain, which won the Kundal Prize, namely the nature of collaboration, or what we call collaboration, in post-war Stalinist Central Europe. The title is The Song of the Party, and it was the anthem of the East German Communist Party, and the lyrics go like this. She gave us everything, sun and wind, always generous. Wherever she was, there was life. We are what we are because of her. She never abandoned us. Even in a frozen world, we were warmed. And now the refrain. The party, she is always right. And comrades, so it will always remain. Since he who fights for the right is always right, he who defends mankind is always right, as raised to life by Lenin's spirit, as welded by Stalin, the party, the party, the party. And it goes die Partei, die Partei, die Partei, but I won't sing the rest. Now, to our modern, or maybe I should say to our postmodern ears, these words are not exactly emotive. On the contrary, sometimes when I read them to audiences like this one, people laugh. They seem absurd, much in the way that old films of Hitler can seem absurd. If you poke around the internet, you can actually find Mickey Mouse singing the song on somebody's homemade video, or spiky-haired teenagers pretending to dance to it. Without an intact ideology to support them, even the art forms of Soviet-style totalitarianism are not merely outdated, they seem funny. And it's hard to imagine how anybody could have sung them with a straight face. Nevertheless, if one had been standing in that room just like this one in East Berlin around about 1950, everyone here would have been singing. Some people, let me stress, would have been singing because they truly believed in the words of the song, and because they really did think that the party was always right. In this period in particular, just after the terrible devastation of World War II, cataclysmic crisis which caused many in both Eastern and Western Europe to doubt that everything they'd ever been taught was right, and to believe that society had to be fundamentally reorganized. Communism did seem to many people like the only viable alternative to the democratic capitalism, which had failed so spectacularly in the 1930s. The world had been shattered, and communism offered a better way to rebuild it. But others would have been singing because they were, for the lack of a better word, I tried to make one up and I never did, reluctant collaborators. So these were the people who did not necessarily believe the slogans they read in the newspapers, but neither did they feel compelled to denounce those who were writing them. They did not necessarily believe that Stalin was an infallible leader, and that he'd welded with Lenin's spirit the party and so on, but nor did they tear down his portraits. They didn't necessarily believe that the party is always right, but nor did they stop singing the song. This was the phenomena that I tried to understand in my book, how people could go to the May Day March in the morning, listen to Radio Free Europe in the afternoon, tell jokes about the party in the evening, and then go to work the next morning at the state factory and continue to participate in building the life of communist Germany or communist Poland. In fact, the horrifying genius of Soviet communism, as conceived in the 1920s, perfected in the 1930s, imposed experimentally on the Baltic states and Eastern Poland in 1939, and then spread by force across Eastern Europe after 1945, its genius was exactly the system's ability to get so many skeptical people in so many different kinds of countries and so many disparate cultures to play along for so many years without much protest. At least for a few decades, Soviet-style communists ruled primitive Albania and industrial Bohemia. They ran Eastern Germany, where the populace had experienced a horrific wave of rape and looting during the Red Army's invasion, not to mention a decade's worth of anti-Soviet propaganda. They even ran Poland, which had fought and won a bloody war against the Soviet Union in 1920. So why was this system, for this short period of time, so successful? And why, at least briefly, did it appear to flourish? And how did it spread to so many countries? I won't tell you the whole story. For that, I'm afraid you have to buy my book, or else listen to me talk all night long. But I will try in the next few minutes to give you just a few elements. For one, experience and practice were part of the explanation. The Red Army and the Soviet secret police, which actually rather unexpectedly found themselves occupying all Central Europe in 1945, were actually very well prepared to take charge. They had already practiced the techniques of totalitarian takeover in their own Central Asian republics in the 1920s, and as I say, in Eastern Poland and the Baltic states, which they had invaded in 1939. Even before they got to Warsaw and Berlin, they had trained cadres and secret agents scattered across the region, working within and around the communist parties. They also had a plan, although I have to be very careful about using that word. From archival documents, we know that Stalin had no doubt that sooner or later all of Europe would be run by communists. His interpretation of Marxist ideology assured him that this was true. But he wasn't certain of how long it would take. A wartime memo written by his foreign minister spoke of decades. And so in 1945, he proceeded with caution. Instead of attempting a full-blooded takeover, Soviet officials in the region aimed to control a handful of key institutions and using a few well-practiced tools. In Iron Curtain, I went through several of these tools, but I'll just mention a few. Probably the Soviet Union's most important institutional tool was one that it created even before entering the region, and that is what became known as the secret police. So the training of what would eventually become the Polish Security Department, the Urząd Bezpieczeństwa, the UBECIA, began as early as 1940 at a special school near Smolensk, so at a period when well, technically in 1940, the Soviet Union was at war with Poland, who actually had divided Poland with Germany. But even during the era when the Soviet Union was theoretically aligned with Poland, which was one of the allies, they kept up this training program. In Germany, the Stasi were tutored from the earliest days by the NKVD, which was the name of the Soviet, what later became the KGB. Later, they enjoyed an especially close relationship with the KGB, whose symbols they adopted and whose techniques they copied, to the extent that I had a former KGB officer explain to me how even in the KGB archives, the manner of archiving, which had been different in Germany and Russia, was changed so that the German files, the Soviet Union, they used to sew their files with a thread, and the Germans started doing that too. So even when you look at some of the files, you see that the system of learning. All of these secret policemen in different countries had a strange and extra legal status in the territories where the Red Army was in place. And even before all of the region's governments were dominated by communists, they had power because they were backed by Soviet reinforcements, as everyone knew. So how did this work? These first secret policemen used terror, but they did so in a way that was far more sophisticated than we sometimes now imagine. So central to the success of the Soviet Union in spreading its system, and incidentally central to the success of so many regimes in the Arab world and Africa and Asia, which later imitated it, was the USSR's careful use not of mass violence, which actually the Soviet secret policemen deliberately avoided after 1945, but of selected violence targeted at elites, at intellectuals, businessmen, priests, ex-politicians, and above all, anyone capable of leading or organizing any kind of spontaneous organization. Ultimately, they were determined to control not only the government and the police and the media and the economy, and those were actually things they did later on, but also all of the elements of what we now call civil society. And so very early on, actually before they got around to nationalizing industry, the Soviet occupiers of Eastern Europe harassed and disbanded youth groups. They forbade the creation of independent sporting organizations, and they treated anyone who worked for a religious or even a secular charity with intense suspicion. So in Hungary in 1946, the Interior Minister banned, among more than 1,000 other groups, the Hungarian Athletic Club, the Count Széchenyi Association of War Veterans, and the Association of Christian Democratic Tobacco Workers, just to give a few examples. In 1949, members of the Young Communist Movement stormed into the Polish YMCA and smashed all of the jazz records. In Eastern Germany, in the first months after the war, there was actually a Soviet occupation there, spent a great deal of time determining which kinds of organizations would and would not be tolerated. Some of these decisions seem to have been fairly arbitrary, and I note for the record, and I never worked out what really was the explanation for it, they were very adamant that hiking clubs be banned at all costs. In the wake of these efforts followed control over the media. Radio stations were especially important to them, and I talk about that in the book, as well as literature, the arts, academia. These efforts were eventually supplemented, of course, by economic policies, by the redistribution of land, the nationalization of heavy industry, and over time, creeping state control of retail and small business. But just because they were Marxist, and just because their rhetoric made it sound as if they believed the economy mattered above all, that doesn't mean they always behave that way. On the contrary, they often, when you read the sequence of events and you read what they were talking about at the time, it's pretty clear that they were more interested in extending control over all aspects of public life to an unprecedented degree. For that reason, I believe that the nations of Eastern Europe were at that time correctly described as totalitarian, a word that fell out of fashion. It was originally coined for the benefit of Mussolini, who also gave the best definition of it in one of his speeches. He said, "Everything within the state, nothing outside the state, and nothing against the state." Though they did not always succeed, in fact, you can probably argue that they never really succeeded, it was certainly the Soviet and the East European communists' intention to create totalitarian regimes which kept everything within the state. Towards the pursuit of that goal, by about 1948, the regimes had, as I say, set out to control not just the economy, not just politics, but sports, leisure time, hospitals, universities, summer camps, children's after-school activities, art, music, museums. And that ambition is exactly this ambition to achieve total control is exactly what put people in ethical and moral binds which we can hardly imagine today. So let me try and give you an example of how this worked. In 1947, Soviet military administration of East Germany passed a regulation governing the activity of publishing houses and printers. So the decree did not nationalize the printing presses, it just decreed that they had to be licensed. And it also stated that all licensed printing presses were required to print only books and pamphlets ordered by central planners. Failure to comply with these simple guidelines did not necessarily lead to murder or arrest, but it could cause the printing press to be shut down. So now imagine you are the owner of a printing press in Dresden, and you are presented with such a law. You have a wife who's ill and 2 teenage children. Your cousin was arrested last year in one of these targeted arrests and has disappeared. You've lost your family home during the firebombing of Dresden, and you are now living in a small state-owned apartment. How likely is it that you will defy the law and agree to print pamphlets which have not been ordered by the central planners? You know you probably won't be killed for doing so, but you also know you will lose your printer's license and therefore your livelihood. Your children might not get into university. Your wife might not get her medicine. You know, it's just not worth it. But once you've made that one compromise, then others follow. You know, so though you dislike communist ideology or you don't really care about it, you're not persuaded by it, when you are presented with the collected works of Stalin, you agree to print them, because why not? And if you don't, other people will. You know, though you disagree with the new government policy on land confiscation, it doesn't affect you personally, and so you don't object to printing pamphlets about that either. You know, meanwhile, all across Eastern Germany, other owners of other printing presses are making the same decisions. And after a while, once again, with no one being shot and no one going to prison, and no one even suffering any particular pangs of conscience, nobody's going to feel that bad about printing a pamphlet about land redistribution. But after a while, the only books left to read are the ones of which the communist regime approves. The same applies to your free time. If you're the owner of that printing press, do you risk your job, your children's schooling, your wife's access to health care, simply in order to play chess in an independent chess club? Of course not. You know, on the other hand, would you consider yourself a deeply implicated collaborator just because you play chess at the Free German Youth's official chess club? No. But again, the result of that behavior was the total disappearance of all unofficial, non-state-sponsored organizations from Eastern European societies, at least for a period of time. So who then was singing the party, the party, the party? It was people who wanted to get on with their lives and people rebuild their countries sometimes, educate their children, feed their families, and stay far away from those in power, but who nevertheless lived in a system which demanded that all of these things be done through state institutions, and people who lived and who also lived in an atmosphere of arbitrary violence. Everything is done with a background to that violence. Even those who were in utterly apolitical jobs sometimes found it impossible not to collaborate. Andrzej Panufnik, a Polish composer who had no particular love for communism, a system he described as artistically and morally dishonest. After the war, he wanted nothing except to rebuild his country and compose music. But in order to do so, he had to join the Union of Polish Composers. And when all the union members were ordered to compete to compose a new song of the United Party, the Polish version of that song, he was forced to do that too. He was told that if he refused to enter the competition, not only would he lose his post, but the whole union would lose the financial support of the state, including all of the other composers. So he wrote a song. He said later, and I quote, you know, literally in a few minutes, setting the ridiculous text to the first jumble of notes which came into my head. It was rubbish, and I smiled to myself as I sent it off to the adjudicators. To his eternal embarrassment, he won first prize. Now, the USSR's intention was clear. It was to eliminate not only the opposition, but also the potential for opposition, and to destroy not only dissent, but even the possibility of future dissent. And let me remind those of you here too young to remember, which is actually at this point almost everybody, round about the year 1950, it looked very much as if the communist parties of Eastern Europe would succeed. You know, the public sphere had been cleansed so thoroughly that a tourist visiting Warsaw, Budapest, or East Berlin, or Prague, Sofia, Bucharest, in the early 1950s would have observed no political opposition whatsoever. And I have read accounts of people who visited those cities at that time, and that is what they wrote. So the press contained regime propaganda. Holidays were celebrated with regime parades. Conversations did not deviate from the official line, at least if an outsider was present. And many analysts, very clever, famous analysts, believed that this system would last forever. So Hannah Arendt, in her famous book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, argued that once the state had imbued its citizens with a totalitarian personality, it would be difficult, if impossible, not impossible, ever to change them. Arendt, the US government, indeed the Soviet government, and many others, expected that totalitarianism would succeed, that mass propaganda and education would triumph, and that the public would and could be brainwashed in Eastern Europe as in the USSR. You all know the end of the story now, and so I won't pretend otherwise. As it turned out, the experience of living in a society which forced everyone to agree with everything dictated by the central government, or at least to say that they did, had profound psychological consequences. Despite all of the state's efforts, despite the education and the propaganda, many people retained an inner sense of disjunction or discomfort. Even the people who were the most active collaborators sometimes felt this. Jacek Czernadel, a writer and youth activist at the time, remembers it like this. He wrote, "I was shouting from a tribune at some university meeting in Wrocław, and I simultaneously felt panicked at the thought of myself shouting. I told myself I was trying to convince the crowd by shouting, but in reality I was trying to convince myself." You know, so if the genius of Soviet totalitarianism was its ability to get people to go along without apparent protest, this was its first fatal flaw, which is the need to conform to a mendacious political reality left many people haunted by the sense that they were leading double lives. A very celebrated Hungarian psychoanalyst, Lili Hajdú-Gyimos, was perhaps the first to diagnose this as a problem in her patients, as well as in herself. "I play the game which is offered by the regime," she told friends, "though as soon as you accept that rule, you are in a trap." At the time of the Arab Spring, Francis Fukuyama wrote a very brilliant short article about the role which dignity and the deprivation of dignity played in convincing people to protest. It caused me to reflect at the time that the communist regimes made the same mistake. By forcing people to collaborate, they made them ashamed and resentful and eventually rebellious. Second fatal flaw lay in the totalitarian nature of the communist project itself. You know, by trying to control every aspect of society, the regimes eventually turned every aspect of society into a potential source of distrust, of dissent. So the state had dictated high daily quotas for the workers. That meant that an East German workers' strike against those quotas in 1953 mushroomed quickly into a political protest against the state. The state had dictated what artists could paint, and so an artist who decided to paint something different immediately became a political dissident. The state had dictated that no one could form independent organizations, and so anybody who founded one, however anodyne, became an opponent of the regime. I was saying at lunch today that almost everybody I know who is my age in Warsaw was at one point a member of the independent and underground scouting movement. Again, an organization institution that in our society is considered anodyne to the point of laughter became a very powerful kind of sub rosa political organization in communist Poland, simply because it was outside of the state. It was a youth group or a youth movement outside of state control. And then, of course, when large numbers of people joined an independent organization, as, for example, when 10 million Poles joined the Solidarity Trade Union in the early 1980s, the regime's very existence was suddenly at stake. Communist ideology and Marxist-Leninist economic theory contained the seeds of their own destruction in one other sense, too. Eastern European governments' claims to legitimacy were based on promises of future prosperity and high living standards, which were supposedly guaranteed by scientific Marxism. You know, all of those banners and posters and the speeches and the newspaper editorials and eventually the television programs spoke of ever faster growth. But although there was some growth, it was never as high as the propaganda made it out to be. Living standards never rose as quickly and dramatically as they did in Western Europe either, a fact which could not long be hidden. Though in 1950, Poland and Spain had very similar GDPs. By 1988, Poland's had indeed risen by 2.5 times, but Spain's had risen 13 times. So Radio Free Europe and travel and tourism all brought home this disparity, which only grew larger as technological change in Western Europe accelerated. Now, in the end, this gap between reality and ideology meant that the communist parties wound up spouting meaningless slogans which they themselves knew made no sense. Marxism became so cocooned in what Orwell once called newspeak that it could not be refuted. My friend, the philosopher Roger Scruton, put it like this. He was describing his experience of the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia as it then was. Facts no longer made contact with the theory, which had risen above the facts on clouds of nonsense, rather like a theological system. The point was not to believe the theory, but to repeat it ritualistically and in such a way that both belief and doubt became irrelevant. In this way, the concept of truth disappeared from the intellectual landscape and was replaced by that of power. But once people were unable to distinguish truth from ideological fiction, then they were also unable to solve or even to describe the worsening social and economic problems of the societies that they ruled. Over time, some political opponents of the communist regimes came to understand these inherent weaknesses of totalitarianism. In his very brilliant 1978 essay, The Power of the Powerless, the Czech dissident Václav Havel called upon his countrymen to take advantage of their rulers' obsession with total control. You know, if the state wanted to monopolize every sphere of human activity, he wrote, then every thinking citizen should work to preserve the independent life of society, which he defined as included everything from self-education and thinking about the world, through free creative activity, its communication to others, to the most varied free civic attitudes, including independent social self-organization, you know, like the Polish Boy Scouts. He also urged them to discard false and meaningless jargon, and he invented the brilliant phrase to live in truth, which means to speak and act as if the regime did not exist. In due course, some version of this independent life of society that Havel talked about, civil society we now call it, began to flourish. You know, the Czechs formed jazz bands, the Hungarians joined academic discussion clubs, the East Germans created an unofficial peace movement. The Poles, as I say, organized scouting troops and eventually independent trade unions. Everywhere, people played rock music, they organized poetry readings, they set up clandestine businesses, they held underground philosophy seminars, they sold black market meat, and they went to church. They also told jokes, which were often very subversive indeed. I urge you to read the joke section in my book. There's a little chapter if you want to cheer up after otherwise some gloomy stories. In a different kind of society, these activities would have been considered apolitical, and even in Eastern Europe, they didn't necessarily constitute an opposition as such. But they gave people what they felt were spheres of freedom, and they allowed them to control some aspects of their own lives, and they gave them back the dignity which the totalitarian regimes, had taken away. Now, as I said, all of you know how the story ended, and of course you all know that for the Central Europeans, for the Poles, the Hungarians, the Czechs, the Germans, the story ended happily. Central European states are now democracies. They're members of the European Union and NATO. Having successfully dodged the financial crisis and avoided the recession, Poland is now one of the fastest growing economies in Europe, so, something that nobody would have predicted 20 years ago. But perhaps because this week is the anniversary of the death of the very brilliant crusading Russian journalist Anna Politkovskaya, and it's also Vladimir Putin's birthday, I've decided to close this lecture not with a celebration of these very real successes, and we can discuss those later if you'd like, which is often how I would end lectures about the communist period, but with a brief reflection on some current events. During the 6 or 7 years that it took me to write Iron Curtain, I was all the time assuming that I was writing a work of history, recounting a closed chapter in the story of Europe. But not very long after the book was published, I watched the Russian invasions of Crimea and then eastern Ukraine with a very eerie and very weird sense of deja vu. Think about what happened last spring. Members of Russian special forces arrived in several parts of Ukraine, supplied with Russian weapons and fortified by Russian logistics. They immediately began to hand out these weapons to members of the criminal classes, members of so-called pro-Russian organizations, some supporters who, for a variety of reasons, wanted a change of system, offering them a rapid path to power. They then systematically attacked government buildings, police stations, mayor's offices, attempting to take control. They behaved, in other words, exactly as the NKVD had behaved in Poland or Hungary when it was recruiting and training the new communist secret police. In 1945, as in 2014, the NKVD also remained in the shadows, sometimes putting on local uniforms, sometimes operating through proxies, sometimes making open moves. Then, as now, they were prepared to adjust their goals depending on how much resistance they encountered and how much support they received. Then, as now, they carried out dubious referendums in order to establish their legitimacy. At one point last spring, while watching this unfold, I even said to myself, I had a moment of almost regret. I wish I'd seen this before I wrote the book, because as I saw it happening, I thought, now I understand better what the mechanism was. Why were people attracted to these NKVD men who came into their countries? And what kinds of people were attracted to them, and why having, particularly in a post-war, in a totally devastated landscape that you would have had in Poland or Germany in 1945, why the arrival of men with guns would have been seen as as something attractive. The Kremlin has not yet imposed in either Crimea or Russia itself the full range of totalitarian controls that once prevailed in the Soviet Union. Probably it can't, and probably it doesn't need to. This is a sort of almost a whole separate lecture, but modern authoritarians have learned from the mistakes of the past, and actually neither Putin nor, for example, the current Chinese government, and there are several other examples, has ever tried to take over all institutions in the same way, understanding very well what the backlash mechanism is. Nevertheless, in recent months, we have seen an acceleration of pressure on the Russian media, on civil society, on academia, as well as on private business, not to mention individual groups such as the Crimean Tatars. We have also seen over the past decade, really more than a decade, the technique of targeted violence, so not mass violence, but violence targeted at leading figures, at particular individuals, seeking to make examples of them. This is another familiar technique from the past. They come out of a Soviet playbook, and we should recognize them as such. We're going to have to learn all over again how to think about them and how to deal with them and how to counter them. Still, history gives us some hope as well. Whatever comes next, let's always remember that communism, which did seem at the time as if it would last forever, did not last. The party is always right. You can get people to sing the song, but you can't get them to sing it forever. As it turns out, human beings do not acquire totalitarian personalities with such ease. Even when they seem bewitched by the cult of the leader of the party, appearances are deceiving. And even when it seems as if they are in full agreement with the most absurd propaganda, even if they're marching in parades and chanting slogans and following orders, you never know when or how the spell can be broken. So, thank you very much. Now, I'm happy to take a few questions. Or do you want to be in charge?
No, you can take your own questions if you like. Go ahead.
You're not screening anybody for me? Okay. Okay, let's do a few. Yeah, hi.
I'll ask you, and I'll be very controversial about it. Everybody knows I'm a human rights lawyer, and I'm not defending totalitarianism. But I'll ask you, why do people cooperate with governments? And I think the answer is a little bit in what you said. In every period of history, people tend to cooperate with a government. For instance, the British were much more pro-German than they were pro-French in 1913. Yet within 2 months of the declaration of war, everybody was against the Huns, who were against civilization. And I could say something about your presentation. It was excellent. I loved it. But you showed your own allegiance. Why do you speak only of the Soviet invasion of Crimea or the Ukraine, where there's something to be said for Russia and the Crimea? Why not the United States in Afghanistan and Iraq? Why not Israel's horrible bombing of Gaza, where innocent people were killed in the name of democracy? It's because in each period, and if you went around this room, you'll find this belief. The most successful brainwashing was not in Poland, where nobody believed it. I was a child there and nobody believed the story. Most successful brainwashing is today's West, when neoliberalism is generally considered right, and when, say, Thomas Piketty writes the absolute truth about what the system is about, every single news, The Economist and everybody else gets up right away and tries to bring it down, because that is the spirit of the times. We're all collaborators in that way in every period. That's why the Russians believed that the little Tsar was kind and good, even if some of his officials were awful. That's why they believed in the other Tsar, Stalin, who was a mass murderer, and nevertheless many Russians believed in it, and they still walk around with his picture on November 7th. I think it's the ability to conform. So let's ask ourselves, is it not that in every society, including in ours, the majority of people accept the ethos of the society until the time has come when it falls apart, when it can no longer be believed?
I will surprise you by saying, yes, that's true, but I think that there are, I'm very happy to say that the ethos of liberal democracy is a better one than the ethos of controlled dictatorship. And I would prefer to live in the ethos of a liberal democracy. So that's, I don't really have any qualms in saying that.
In 1950,
sorry,
segregation?
Yes, I wanted to ask you, how do you see the future for the Ukraine right now?
Oh dear, the future of Ukraine.
Well, what are your thoughts?
I feel not, I have to be careful. I am, in some ways, very optimistic about the future of Ukraine, in that I've been going to Ukraine for actually 2 decades. My first book that I ever wrote, you very sweetly described as a travelogue. I think it's actually even less serious than that. It was a small book of journalism about the region. Was partly about Ukraine. I was in Lvov and I was in Western Ukraine in the early 1990s, right at the moment of Ukrainian independence, and I covered that story for The Economist and for other newspapers at the time. So I have had a long experience of going there, and was there this spring, and I have to say it's the first time I've been to Ukraine where I met people who reminded me of the kinds of people that I met in Poland in the early 1990s. In other words, people who were thinking about how to reconstruct the state, what the nature, how to end corruption in a real way and not in a superficial way. It's not just about creating institutions, it's about re-education and changing the way the law works. And in that sense, there's a generation of Ukrainians who identify themselves as Europeans, by which they mean we respect the rule of, we want to live in a state which is like the Europe of our dreams, meaning a state where there's the rule of law, where it's possible to found your own business and run it without paying tribute to the mafia, where there's decent education for people, where there's decent health care, where there aren't these, where it's not, people aren't stealing vast amounts of money. So I feel that Ukraine now has a generation of people like that in sufficient numbers. What I don't know is whether the current Russian government will allow Ukraine to change itself. When Russia talks about having when Russia wants a sphere of influence, what it means is it wants a Ukraine that has a system like its system, by which I mean a nepotistic is the wrong word, it's kleptocratic autocracy, in which the rules are rigged so that a very small group of people make an enormous amount of money, and that money is then shared up the ladder with Putin, and the people directly around him. He does not want Ukraine to have rule of law or have European-style institutions, and he does not want Ukraine to become integrated with Europe, because that would then raise a question in the minds of Russians. If they can do it, why can't we? Ukraine is very much a issue of domestic interest to the president of Russia, in the sense that it's not really geopolitics, in the sense that he cares what happens there because of its effect on him. An integrated pro-Western democratic Ukraine, which I admit is now a very far thing perhaps in the distant future, would be a threat to the kleptocratic Russia, in which all media is ultimately controlled by the same person, and in which all public conversation is also controlled. And if there was a different kind of Ukraine being culturally and linguistically and in other ways close to Russia, then if it can happen in Ukraine, why couldn't it happen in Russia? And it would be a challenge to him personally. So my fear is that he won't let that happen, he can't let that happen, and whether he will continue to prevent it through military actions, as he has done in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, or whether it will be other forms of sabotage or other forms of undermining, which he's actually used quite successfully in the past, I don't know. But I don't think the story is over at all, and I think we're at we're at one stage of the process, and it is conceivable there could be an acceleration of events quite soon. Ukrainian elections are at the end of this month, and that right now, according to the opinion polls, if there is a new parliament chosen, it will be the first parliament in independent Ukraine which does not have a major pro-Russian or Russian-funded party. And I don't know whether Putin can allow that to happen, or whether he will agree to that to happen. So we will soon find out. Anyway, sure, in the back.
When these events, which are so important to European future, right? I mean, Ukraine is in the midst, right? It's the piece that's the vice from the East and the West, are playing out. It seems very difficult for the West to imagine any kind of way of having leverage other than economic. Is the economic leverage, they keep telling us the ruble is falling and the economy is falling apart. Is that leverage going to have any impact that people in Russia can take advantage of? I saw some massive demonstration in Russia, but I saw it on one TV station for 3 minutes. It didn't seem to make much press in the in North America, but it seemed
quite
important.
a big demonstration. I don't know. There has been an impact of the sanctions. The ruble has crashed, and inflation is going up quickly. What I don't know yet is whether that will. I don't see what the mechanism between that happening and any kind of change of power or even change of policy is. I mean, if Putin himself is insulated from those problems, then why should, maybe he doesn't care. I mean, one of the most extraordinary decisions he's made recently was his decision to respond to what had been actually, I mean, you can argue about whether they were good or bad, but these rather targeted sanctions at individual people. He responded with a food boycott. And the food boycott, okay, yes, it hurts Polish apple farmers and Lithuanian meat producers and so on, but it's also very damaging to ordinary Russians. I mean, it's the one thing he could have chosen that will hurt lots of people, because it will make food prices go up. Because food imports into Russia is not just whatever, Parmesan cheese and camembert, it's also cucumbers and the enormous amount of food is very cheap. Food is not cheap, but ordinary food is imported. It's not a problem just for wealthy Muscovites, and that either means that he doesn't care because he's insulated, or it may also mean that he's hoping to use that sense of economic emergency as a way of creating hysteria. And I don't have an explanation. I don't know whether sanctions will or can work myself, and I. Hope that people are thinking about other kinds of options as well.
Is there any possibility for clandestine opposition in Russia now?
There is. It's very complicated to understand what's going on in Russia. I had just spent yesterday morning with a couple of Russian journalists whom I've known for a long time, who were in London talking about this. There is opposition, almost of the old-fashioned kind, in that people are afraid again. I would be very careful of opinion polls these polls that show this huge support for Putin. Because right now we're once again at the stage where, you know, if you're a taxi driver in Krasnoyarsk and somebody phones you up and says, hello, I'm from the Levada Institute in Moscow, what do you think of President Putin? Chances that you're going to say anything but he's wonderful are very low. There's also now a complicated relationship that people have. You know, they're confused. There is absolutely unified media. I mean, in that sense, it's become very Soviet again. But once you have totally unified media, then people also become slightly suspicious of it. I mean, it's much more sophisticated now than it was. There are different kinds of media. There's tabloids, and I think there's quite a lot of confusion, and there's a lot of feeling of, I just don't want anything to do with this. Politics is dirty. There is also, there's a lack of opportunity. There's a lack of political possibilities for people. But there have been, we know from what happened in 2011 that there's certainly in the big cities, there's fairly major numbers of people who would like to see a different kind of system. And we also know that even in other parts of the country that if you ask people not about politics but about corruption, if you ask them how is your city run or how does your local hospital work, you get very angry responses. So there is some discontent, but right now I don't see what the mechanism is by which it changed. But again, sometimes these, as I said, sometimes these things happen very fast. I mean, actually in 1988, or indeed I would go as far as to say in the spring of 1989, nobody saw that the Berlin Wall was going to fall. So sometimes things happen quickly. Okay, one and then two.
Excuse me, you have any idea why Putin why Putin didn't allow the Ukraine to sink? Why didn't? Because it's supposed to have big changes, economic changes, Balcerovich type, Jeffrey Sachs, etc., all those ideas, and people will be suffering, that's for sure, economically. Why? What prompted, what made Putin do what he did? He could have waited next 2 years and the pro-Russian sentiments would revive. I cannot fathom why it happened that way.
I have no window into his brain, sadly.
Yeah, but your idea, your idea.
He was making a different point about, I think he was genuinely interested in changing the borders.
Besides, he revived NATO. He revived certain, dormant trends in the Ukraine. After all, Montreal, London didn't see anti-American administration after Putin attacked Ukraine. That's, of course, a sarcastic joke, but you know that.
No, I think actually the desire to change the borders is very real. And there have been these maps floating around Moscow for a long time.
So fast. He could have waited a year or two. Don't know.
I don't know. He was impatient.
Okay.
I don't know. Any questions about my book? No. So I'll you and then you. And
well, thank you for your presentation, and thank you above all for your defense of liberal democracy. Although your friend Danielle Crittenden probably went a little too far in describing you as Solzhenitsyn. I've been reading your recent columns about Poland with a great sense of being disturbed, and they make for hair-raising reading, really. What I don't get a sense of from your columns or from your writings is how the countries of Eastern Europe, now newly prosperous, see themselves in the challenges that the West faces now. There are no lack of them, whether it's bullying by Islamist terrorism, or Chinese bullying, or Ebola, for example. What do you think?
How does Central Europe see itself, or how does the West see itself?
How does Central Europe, how does Poland see? Is Poland willing to, for example, send troops to fight ISIS?
Well, this is a difficult question because Poland has been willing to do that, and I mean Poland was had a major presence in Iraq and a major presence in Afghanistan, and many in Poland now wonder whether that was worth it, because although they'd proved themselves willing to do this, to send troops and so on, they now wonder whether NATO will defend them. And what we've seen in the last couple of years in particular is a sort of slight breakdown in what could have been a very strong Atlantic alliance in Central Europe, based on, creeping doubt is a very it's a very dangerous thing, based on doubt as to whether there's a real American commitment to them and to their concerns and to European concerns. I mean, this is in a way, we can argue about why it's happened, but I mean, absolutely the question of whether America is still engaged and whether it's still going to play the same kind of role that it used to play is fairly fundamental to people's questions about whether they should be involved or not. I mean, I think if the Poles knew of a way how they could stop Ebola, they would do it. I'm not sure they have the. I'm not sure what the concern is, but I mean the Central Europeans have played a role in broader Western and NATO engagements in the last decade, and some now question whether that was the right thing to do, because some of those engagements haven't worked out so well, and also, was their contribution really recognized? Was it was it welcomed? There's some doubt about that. But I mean, if the broader question is, do they see themselves as part of the West? Then yes, absolutely. I mean, you can varies from country to country and politician to politician, and we can have an argument about some of them. But no, I think in a very broad sense, yes. I mean, they are absolutely active members of the EU and NATO. So, I've forgotten who I said I would call on.
Yeah, we speak of the politics and the history, but I don't know. I'll ask the psychologist in you. What is the lingering psychology of these times? I mean, I'm of Latvian origin, and we're now in our 24th year of renewed independence, and yet we see that lingering psychology from these particular times still in our society. Is that a generational thing? We feel it, between the generations? Is it people who experienced that time who linger with those thoughts and those feelings, or is it up to the new generation to sort of grasp onto the ideas of democracy?
You're right to describe it as psychological, because I've worked on this a little bit, but the question of what is the communist hangover or what is the legacy of communism in that part of the world is pretty hard to answer unless you're talking about individual people, or maybe you could talk about social groups. You could talk about my friends, the former underground scouts. How did the period affect them? Well, it actually made them feel incredibly empowered, and once communism fell, they rushed to take positions in the new system, and some of them are they're running Poland today. I mean, so the impact varies from person to person and country to country. There are a few things that communism did which remain in all these countries, and I should also say that a lot of the various pathologies of the moment, bad economic performance, the rise of the far right, some of those aren't really Eastern European or ex-communist issues; they're European issues. I'm really tired of hearing about the rise of the far right in Eastern Europe. First let's talk about France, and then let's talk about Austria, and then we can talk about the rise of the far right in Eastern Europe. So some of what people talk about as ex-communist is really European. And then another caveat is that, of course, communism, we're now at the 25th anniversary. At some point, we have to stop talking about ex-communist Europe as if it were a thing. We didn't talk about post-Habsburg Austria anymore. At some point, we're in a new era, and we don't talk about post-communism anymore. But there are a few things. I mean, there is a kind of paranoid strain in politics that you often get in the region, and also chronic lack of trust and suspicion. People, and I'm not going to think of how to translate it. There's a phrase in Polish that means, whatever you see, there's always a second explanation. Drugi dno. There's always some behind the truth, there's another truth. You know, whatever is in the media, that can't be right. There's some other thing going on. It's kind of conspiratorial, slightly paranoid mindset, which is very, very common in that region. I mean, actually, we have it in the United States of America as well. But it's particularly widespread, and it's sort of cancerous on democratic politics, because it means that, you know, whoever is in power is automatically a figure of suspicion, whatever he or she has actually done, for better or for worse. And so that seems to me a kind of hangover. I mean, you know, if you live in a society where people really were spying on you, and, you know, your government really was controlled by a cabal of foreigners, and, you know, the media really was being run on puppet strings from Moscow, then making the transition to a different kind of society can be different. And I think that actually plagues all these countries, and it plagues both politics and the media. I would say that's the worst hangover. And I don't know whether, you know, yes, the new generation thinks differently. I mean, we actually now have people in their 30s and even late 30s, you know, now can't really be considered, you know, there are people who were maybe teenagers or young teenagers when the wall fell, don't really have memories of living in a communist society in that way. So we're now really are in a generation of people who are, who have to be considered sort of post-communist. But, you know, that kind of suspicion and paranoia does pass down, and I think some of that has continued. Anyway, sorry, I gave about 3 answers to that. Sorry, go ahead. And then one more, yeah. No, I'm just being told to stop soon, but anyway, go ahead. Okay.
What are some of the ways that collaboration gets corrupted? I think the first speaker suggested that you can perhaps think of our own society and its collaboration. We have YouTube and fashion, and it's something that's natural to humans to collaborate. So how does it get corrupted?
I'm not sure I understood the question. So collaboration is I actually didn't use the expression collaborate. I used the expression reluctant collaborators. I was saying this at lunch to some of the colleagues here today. When I first started working on this project, one of the ideas of the book was that I would try and understand exactly this phenomenon of collaboration. And I was stopped in my tracks after a lecture I did in Germany by an East German woman who said to me, "What are you talking about when you say collaboration? You know, who were the collaborators in Eastern Europe?" You know, probably you could, particularly in the immediately post-war period, you could pick out a few, you know, very violent thugs and people who, you know, committed many murders, and, you know, other people who, you know, informers who turned in their best friends and so on. But actually most people were, you know, simultaneously collaborators and opponents. They were reluctant collaborators and they were passive opponents. They were, you know, they were trying to get along, but they were sometimes going along with it. So collaboration is, even defining what it is in a society like, even in a totalitarian society where you can see, where it seems black and white, can be very difficult. So I'm not sure I would use that word in our society at all, actually. I mean, I don't think we're asked to do what people in those societies were asked to do. Nobody here is told that if you don't march in the May Day parade and you don't vote for this party, then you're fired, or at least not very often. So maybe in Chicago, I don't know. Maybe one or two more, you, and then you.
Yeah, so how do you see the future for post-communist country cooperation, Visegrad Group, et cetera, with, I mean, a lot of Russian pressure and oil or gas. It seems there's been a lot of breakdown within the cooperation of these countries, something that I believe should be a prominent or very important thing for all these countries to look at.
The Visegrad Group was working brilliantly until February of this year, and then it has shown fissures. You know, again, part of the problem I think is the one I've alluded to already, which is if you're Hungarian and you have a deep lack of belief that the United States will come to your rescue, and you wonder whether the Germans really care what happens to you, then you are inclined to try and make a separate deal with Russians to ensure that you have your gas delivered. So one of the things that happened through the lack of Western solidarity has meant that that has sown seeds of doubt in that region, particularly southeastern Europe. Actually, it's not just the Visegrad Group. I would say Italy, Greece, and others. Wonder whether the West, as a sort of integrated institution, is really going to help them if they need help. And I think that has been one of the side effects. If the pressure gets worse, that may change. I mean, I think we're at a funny intermediate stage right now. But if people feel truly under pressure from the Russians and truly frightened, then you may see them revert to wanting to be integrated with the West again, would be my guess. But one more, yeah.
I'm not sure, maybe I'm a bit off topic from some of these questions here, but I'd like to go back to the book, actually.
Oh, great!
Because I really enjoyed the presentation, and I quite enjoyed this discussion of how media and public sphere emerge, and that seems to be an underlying theme in your book. And I wanted to ask you, or to comment a little bit on, what is the role of the public sphere? And you seem to be suggesting there is going to be a vitality and endurance in the public sphere despite everything that the Soviets will do. And I wonder, are there some problems in relying upon public sphere as such a strong central thesis in your book?
I'm not sure what you mean by public sphere. Can you?
Well, I think it was a term.
You mean the sort of discussion of civil society?
Well, I think it was a term that you actually used at one point in the lecture.
In the lecture, yeah.
And that's part of the question. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by public sphere, and how does that play out?
I think the point about what the sort of essence of totalitarianism was that the state, and actually really the party, was trying to control every aspect of society directly. And so that meant not just the things we associate it with, like nationalizing industry or running the political system. It meant they tried to control, literally children's after-school programs, all forms of public life, so theater, the arts, music, film, but also kind of organized events, after-school activities, weekend activities, leisure time. There's an enormous amount of discussion. The Communist Party spent a lot of time talking about people's leisure. What are people doing in their free time, and how can we make sure they're not doing anything bad? So the attempt to control all aspects of life was really almost is one of the most striking features of that system. It didn't succeed. That was, I think, my point. They wanted it to succeed, and that was why I would describe it as totalitarian. It didn't succeed because, there was always some teenager who'd just rather go off and drink vodka and not go to the meeting of the young communists, or because there was always some, I interviewed an former aging actress while I was writing the book. I can't remember if she's made it into the book or not, but who was telling me how, when they would do Hamlet or when they would do classic plays, there was always some line that you could read in a double sense, that would be read as a political innuendo. And whenever that line happened, the actor would step aside and say very loudly, something rotten in Denmark, or whatever the line was, and then the audience would cheer, And so even when you were doing Shakespeare or you were doing some classic play, you could put politics in it. So this, I think my point was that they attempted to control this, and they wanted to control it, and meaning really all by public sphere, everything that was discussed or said or done or organized in public. But it didn't work because Hannah Arendt was wrong, and people don't have totalitarian personalities, and people would go through the motions, but they would retain some distance from it, and they would go to the May Day parade, but they would, wear blue jeans or, roll their eyes when somebody said something. And so you had this phenomenon of, theoretically everything was controlled, but in practice it often wasn't. And that, and that's the sort of weird essence of that system. That became even more pronounced in later years. My book is about this early period, which is actually the period when there's the most violence, and when you had the harshest regimes. And later on, the systems broke down in much more comprehensive ways. There were actually, the book ends with the Hungarian Revolution, which was actually a violent revolt. And then there were other kinds of revolts later on. So the attempt to control this public sphere was a characteristic of communism. It's important to understand that that's what they were trying to do, but it's also important to understand how it failed. So.
I actually think it's a testimony to Anne's breadth that so many of these questions have been about contemporary events.
No, I'm used to it. It's right.
Usually happen to historians.
No, it happens to me.
I'm actually not going to formally thank Anne, or informally thank her very much, because Andrew Dial is going to thank Anne. Andrew is a Cundill Fellow, and these are fellowships that are funded in the Department of History and Classical Studies generously by the Cundill Foundation.
Oh, right. I'll make way for that. Okay.
Yes, and I'll invite
Thank you
Andrew
very
to
much. Thank you. Oh, you're giving me something. Sorry. Okay, I won't walk away then.
Well, on behalf of the Cundill Foundation, of this wonderful audience, we'd like to thank you for a very stimulating discussion, particularly one that ranges from both the present day to, but also has historical depth to it. So,
thank you very much.
We'd like to present you.
Oh, excellent! Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Oh, right, with pictures. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anna. That's a lot lighter than the thing I handed to you at the Cundill Prize.
It is.
Anyway, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us this afternoon. If you join us in the foyer for a cocktail, we'd be pleased to welcome you. Thank you again.